Hey, I'm Matthew, Tank's managing editor.
And I'm Paula. I'm the culture editor of the Culver Journal.
And author, for people that
And
don't.
also a writer, journalist, editor, all sorts of things that you are as well. So
Yes, moonlighting. So we just watched Andrey Zvyagintsev's The Return, which was his debut feature. And it's set in, I'm not exactly sure whereabouts it is set in Russia, but I understood it was filmed very near St. Petersburg during the White Nights, which gives it that amazing kind of blue color palette that I'm sure we'll get into. But Paula, what were your first impressions of the film?
so I watched it twice, and I guess the first time I saw it, I was just kind of impressed by the kind of dark Tarkovskian mood of the film. But the second time I watched it last week for this conversation, I think I was just struck by how much it resembles a fairy tale in terms of structure. Yeah, what were your thoughts?
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I picked up on both of those aspects. Certainly the Tarkovskian. I think for me, the Tarkovskian inheritance came through in the camera work. Actually, like there were these kind of slow creeping shots, a lot of like narrative pushed forward by silence, and the elements felt almost as if they were directing as much as Zvyagintsev.
And there
But
was that
mm,
there was also a bit of mystery, with the
mm,
box, which could be interpreted in a kind of mystical way, in the way Tarkovsky can. But sorry, go on.
yeah. But I think I don't know. The main thing I came away thinking about was the fact that it was both kind of a very, very Russian and very non-Russian at the same time. And when I say non-Russian, I mean this is, as you'd say, quite sort of fabulous. It's a story that could be set anywhere. Um, we have this triangle of father, two sons. I mean, already you think of, Bible stories that kind of involve those people, and also the setting too was we're in this kind of archipelago, um, which which could or could not be Russia. So I felt that was one thing, but then at the same time, I think it is very Russian. Um, One in the kind of Tarkovskian echoes, but also in the relationships, the domestic setting, where at the start where we see the father kind of very directly take control of this domestic setting in a very kind of, I suppose, um, old-fashioned way, but with that, I suppose, trope of to be a man is to be unemotional, is to be dominating, and I don't know. I suppose that's something that we might associate with Russian men.
Yeah, I did think about the way power gets interpreted and like seen in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. But so initially, I had this theory that in Eastern Europe, power gets seen as like the ability to um, make other people do what you want, or to submit to your authority. Whereas in Western Europe, I felt like there was more emphasis on self-control. And actually, in this film, we see that he's able to, well, he tries to make the son submit to his authority, and he succeeds to some extent, but not fully. But then he's actually unable to control his own emotions, and all of these bursts of violence are, a proof of weakness and vulnerability that he can't accept. But now, I don't know if my scheme quite works that well, because there's something to do, with, like, I feel like in England, for instance, there are different ideas about authority and parenting, and raising children in different classes, in different kind of ethnic groups and so on. So yeah, my scheme doesn't work quite so neatly.
But I think another thing I was so taken by the, I think, loneliness that surrounds each of the men. So the father and the two sons. I mean, the two sons, of course, form this alliance, which really is about survival as opposed to anything more than that, because the father becomes very threatening, and then they're actually wondering, like, would he do something? But actually they're still quite divided, um in that the younger Ivan, I think, is far more willing to stand up to his father. And there's that incredible scene right in the middle of the film where he's like, what are you doing to us? Which I think is such a kind of moment of, I felt like, a kind of pressure valve that comes open, and he says exactly what I think the viewer has been feeling. But then the older son takes on a more sort of diplomatic role where he's trying to kind of keep his father happy. I think he wants validation from his father, and so you have these two very, very different kind of responses. Um, and in the meanwhile, the father is emotionally and often very physically absent. He's off, as you say, like finding the box, or he's scouting in the forest. He often leaves the children, to go and do something, and we never really learn what that something is. But there's a suggestion that it's some kind of criminal activity, maybe from his past, maybe partly why he was away and came back.
Or military, could be either.
Military for sure, and I think like that is definitely like a reality that um, yeah, that Russia faced at the time. And it also made me think actually about the, um, I don't know, when I spent time in Russia, I always remember learning about the very young life expectancy of Russian men.
Mm.
And of course, the shocking but not, but somehow quite inevitable, I think, ending of the film, I don't know, made me kind of look at that once more. And um, I don't know, there's a sort of sense of the fatherless generation that these two children kind of embody in some way.
Yeah, I was also thinking about that, and I looked up some stats, to kind of see if this was just a rumor that I heard. But apparently, yeah, a third of families in Russia are led by single mothers.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was thinking that, like we see in the film, often the grandmother also comes in the pic, so it's not, kind of single parented um, family necessarily. It's more like a mix between
Mm.
a traditional kind of extended family and,
And
the
isn't that
absence
wonderful?
of men.
Yeah, sorry to jump. Isn't that a wonderful scene? I think where I think we see the grandmother once, and she has such a look of you, like such a critical look on her face about this father who's returned, and just immediately inserts himself in this really kind of patriarchal way. I think I don't know, I think it's such a strong scene, and we only see her once, but she's a force that's kind of felt throughout the film. I think in a way that you always feel like that the grandmother and the mother are sort of waiting for them. So the return not only becomes about the father, but these boys need to return, too. Um,
Yeah, and I was thinking that, the return of the father in a way brings the absence of the mother and the grandmother, throughout this whole film. And that's exactly like what we're missing is, closeness and intimacy and sweetness,
yeah,
tenderness. And it's kind of clear that this is what the mother and maybe the grandmother were bringing in the
yeah. I
picture.
mean, that's not to sort of idealize their life too much part before, because obviously the first scene is a scene where I think the younger child is quite traumatized by the peer pressure of jumping and not jumping. But in a way, that's the kind of normal childhood that these boys should have. Like they're kind of, that's on a far different level, I think, to um,
Mm,
the kind of
yeah.
the very like male dominated, um, scene that the father throws them in. But
Yeah, I don't know if these kids should have, this kind of bullying pressure. I mean,
yeah.
maybe you as a former rugby player have experienced this a lot more and it's like normal to you. But for me,
Mm.
I think that would have been quite traumatizing. And also, what I wanted to mention is that, it's interesting to follow the coming of age story, of the younger brother and the way he's so fearful at the beginning, and then he becomes the stronger character, in the relation to the father.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah, it just seems like there's this play basically with the concept of power. Because yeah, the older brother seems the stronger one at the beginning, but then you realize that he's just going with whoever is stronger. He's just going with the flow, like not resisting it, but
That comes back
rather.
to what you were saying about what is, how do you how does power manifest and what actually is power? But I suppose one other aspect that's a lot more, a lot less kind of dark is the blues, the kind of the beautiful color palette that I think the film shot, and that I think is worth just pausing on, because it for me it was also always quite a little bit dreamlike. I think it gives it this slightly dreamlike veneer, and that is both comforting and also very discomforting. I think that there is a slightly nightmarish quality to it as well, particularly as things start really kind of unraveling, and the father clearly like poses some kind of threat. Um, but at the same time, it's just a really stunning, like artistic thing to watch.
Yeah, and it's very theatrical. Like that first scene where we see the father sleeping, for instance.
Mm,
It doesn't feel quite, I don't know, naturalistic. It's more like very well organized,
mm.
very aestheticized. And yeah, I think that part of the strength of the film comes from that.
I think that's quite a Tarkovskian image as well. I feel like a lot of his films, I'm thinking Mirror and Stalker, kind of start with a bed or a person sleeping in a bed, bodies in a bed, as if, um, I don't know, like there's some kind of process of awakening about to happen, and but it's all quite eerie and yeah, unstable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something else that I thought about, that's more like a personal association that I had thinking about this film was, like I was thinking about parenting styles and the nurturing parent versus the kind of authoritative parent. And
Mm.
I realized that I remembered something that my mom told me, which is that her parents were really, really authoritarian with her. Like I never saw that side of them as grandparents to me, but with her and her siblings, they were really, really tough, and they only started telling them that they loved them once they saw Latin American soap operas in the 90s. And it just made me think about how, them, like this father in this film, just didn't know how to,
Mm.
be nurturing parents. There wasn't something um, that they did, there wasn't a model
Mm.
that maybe they had that they could follow. So yeah, I don't know. Initially, I guess I didn't have much sympathy for the father, but then thinking about this made me consider that it's also not his fault that he's so out of his depth in this situation.
Mm. Because yeah, I think absolutely. I think in the kind of projection of masculinity that he's trying to bestow onto his children, which is very narrow, militaristic, you realize that that's his world, that's his universe. His universe only stretches as far as the boundaries of that idea of masculinity. And I think you're right. I think there is a slight sympathy um, for for him, because he's trapped in it himself. There is a kind of solitude there. Um,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what did you think about that scene where he doesn't help his sons, when they're getting mugged?
Mm. It's quite hard to watch that, actually. I found that quite it kind of goes against, I think, I felt like it goes against your kind of natural instincts, so you just want to run and save. I mean, I don't have children, but I imagine that's what I would feel.
Yeah, because it's not clear, like, does he get, does he just get blocked, or does he want to train them, the tough way?
No,
Um,
this is it's definitely it's part of his kind of um yeah, militaristic education that he's trying to, like, yeah, give to his children. But it feels like, I think that's there might be a time and a place for something like that. I think if it's done through love, but I don't think there was. You feel the love is lacking, and so
mm,
these kind of lessons that he's trying to teach his children feel far more grounded in working through his own kind of internal conflicts that he hasn't been able to resolve, perhaps, as opposed to, yeah, some kind of overarching education, that's about preservation and survival that he's trying to give his children. I think it's not that. It's very much his own conflicts coming out, and unfortunately, they're the victims, of that. So it's a kind of um, form of neglect, I think. Yeah.
mm. Yeah, I was also thinking that one other kind of film or director that this film made me think of is Andrea Arnold, who's
Mm,
just in terms of the toughness
yeah.
of the kind of coming of age stories that she tells, especially in Fish Tank.
Yeah.
Um,
Also on TANKtv, I might just say.
nice.
It's short,
Um,
and I think all this idea of the parentless generation as well, like kids fending for themselves, often in quite brutal settings as well. I think that's the other thing that we haven't really touched upon is
the
the
poverty.
background, yeah, well, and also the ecological
Mm.
setting. The fact that they're out there and around water, forests. That this isn't an easy place to survive, and threats loom everywhere, and so it's all quite denuded of life and love, and I think that's both in the kind of intimate relationships and also in the landscape.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
yeah.
and I guess if I was to make connections between this film and Zvyagintsev other films, then there's this link, there's the family that he's concerned with in Loveless, for instance, and there's
Mm,
the kind of question of authority that he's concerned with, or yeah, liberty that he's concerned with in the Leviathan, and
mm,
this film seems to come in between, especially, I don't know, if you think about this metaphor of the state as, the kind of father versus mother figure and individual's relation to the state. But maybe that's me kind of reading into it a bit too much.
mm. I mean, I think I see I think I like the link as well with Leviathan, in that obviously Leviathan is set in Russia, but it's a story based on something from America, from Texas. And I think in the same way, this story, Leviathan, Elena as well, is another film. They're all very, they're all a bit like parables, a little bit like myths, I think. So there's definitely some connections. But I do think it's no, I think there is a link to authority there. I think it's less politically overt than some of the other films, that are far more about class and power structures. There obviously are, as you touch upon, a lot of there's a lot about power in there, but I think it's, for me, this is much more about masculinity and
Mm-hmm.
and the relationships between men, um, and the fact they're not great.
And do you see I don't know, ideas about masculinity in Russia being similar to ideas about masculinity here in the UK, or in what ways do they differ?
I mean, I think I think the ideas around masculinity have changed a lot in both here and Russia over the last even over the last 5 years, but 10 years, 20 years. And I think that remember this film, this came out, I
in
guess,
2003.
years ago. Yeah. So, but also I think it is projecting a very antiquated, atavistic kind of idea of masculinity, one based on, as we talked about, self-control and violence um and so I don't know. So I definitely don't identify with that type of masculinity. However, I do still see elements, for example, in that opening scene, that is something that is by no means that kind of like peer pressuring, um, pressure on men to be strong and daring. I don't think that's necessarily changed all too much.
Mm.
The trick is to just step out of the structure if you can.
Yeah, yeah. And what do we think is in that box?
The box. That's the key.
Hmm.
Um,
Is it
yeah,
like,
like in Stalker, I think there's maybe this sense that it's some kind of promise of fulfilling your ultimate dream. But no, I don't know. I don't know. What do you think? Do you have ideas around it?
I don't know. I like my first guess was that there's some sort of, I don't know, explosive in there, but it wouldn't make sense because like he wouldn't want to be close to it. Um,
Or is it
but
just
I guess,
vehicle to bring him away from his children? I wonder if it's it's certainly an object that connects him to his past in some way.
yeah, I
That
think
they're not part of.
it's definitely symbolical, and yeah, it just shows, yeah, the weight of his past, and
I think, yeah, nice way of putting it. It still really like looms very centrally in his life.
and yeah, and we don't get to find out because the kids never find out, and they never fully understand him.
And I think that speaks to as well. Like that's also comes across in the camera work. I think there's that scene where they arrive at this small kind of port, and he has to go and meet with someone, and the kids look through this kind of telescope, and the camera is seen through that lens. And so there's a real kind of, as soon as we encounter the father in this kind of situation, I feel there's like the kids then we see the fact that they only see partially. There's a kind of obstructed vision going on that comes across really well, I think, in the camera work. And I notice the shots become more unstable, and I think the kids too probably feel the sense of not being held, like the camera isn't really being held, when the father, yeah, moves away from them and then has to go and deal with these mysterious dealings that
Dodgy dealings.
maybe that's a good question to,
yeah, I was
have very like strong opinions about what's in the box.
I was actually gonna ask one final question or make one final comment about the photographs, that we see at the end.
Yes, talk about that. Yeah.
Because they look like they're from a really happy, holiday.
Totally.
And
yeah.
I was like, is Zvyagintsev trying to kind of downplay the role of photography and like and say, oh, cinema can achieve a lot more than photos can, or is that?
I thought that too. I think I actually had that thought, because they are like, they're beautifully composed. I mean, and they're filled with smiling faces and heads sticking out the car window. And I wondered, what you thought, like, is photography this like impoverished mechanism of representation? And I was like, oh wait, did I like not see the same film? Did they actually have like a great time? And we've only seen like one half of the story. I mean, obviously their dad dies, so it's not great. But yeah, but then I also wondered if there was a kind of like, because it was mainly of the boys, I think that the father isn't really in them. And so I wondered if there was also a little bit of a like, I don't know, like a celebration of these boys' resilience, and a reminder of their youthfulness and their carefreeness, despite the fact what they've been through is like utterly traumatic. So I think it's a really thought-provoking kind of coda, and also it's all in black and white, which I think is a really kind of sticks out against the blues of the film.
Yeah, and I read a review which was saying that, oh, you know, these two boys are so artistic. You know, they're writing this diary and they're taking these beautiful pictures. So if you do believe that kind of line of thought, then it could be, you know, this could be about like the saving power of art, or like, you know, the resilience art can give you. But I don't know. Kind of ambiguous.
Yeah, well, I think that's a nice note to end on. Great. Well,
Я могу, Кат. Слышишь, я могу!